What is up, guys? Tonight on Project RX-8 we're going to focus on a little bit of reliability, and one of the most critical components and biggest problem areas with the car all stems down to the factory ignition system. When Mazda started producing the RX-8, there was, because of the amount of complaints that there were from RX-7 owners for the cost of the ignition coils, they opted to go with a cheaper ignition coil. The downside of this is that the coils typically crap out around 30,000 miles, and even sooner depending on how hard the car is driven, if it's seen a lot of track time and whatnot. But when the coils start to degrade, everything else kind of goes to crap. So what happens is that the spark gets weaker and weaker over time, and then this promotes carbon buildup because the combustion's not happening fully. You're having unburned fuel still in the combustion area. Fuel gets into the exhaust stream and it ignites in the catalytic converter, damaging the cat and the O2 sensor. As the catalytic converter gets damaged, it clogs. Now exhaust gases temperatures raise, and that can promote detonation and just more heat overall in the combustion area. That excess heat causes seals to warp and distort. And on top of that, with the carbon, causes uneven wearing in the rotor housing surfaces, and it just creates a complete mess. So most of the engine failures that happen prematurely were a result of the ignition coils failing early and not being addressed right away. So I picked this car up with 22,000 miles on it. I did all the typical maintenance stuff that you get when you get a new car. So I did transmission fluid, differential fluid, oil, coolant, all the normal stuff. A couple thousand miles later, I opted to change the spark plugs and wires because I don't think they've been changed. But more recently, I started noticing that the car's been feeling a little bit down on power. So suspecting that the coils were starting to fail just because it is such a common problem. Oh, and another issue I noticed is that at idle, the car would kind of have like a little bit of a sputter here and there, almost like a misfire. Never got any misfire codes on the dash for the cell lighting up, but I did notice the car was starting to feel down on power. Well, sure enough, the other night I was coming home, driving rather spiritedly through one of my favorite routes. I pulled the car into the garage and shut it off. As I got out of the car, I heard a lot of exhaust ticking of the metal cooling as it got like much more than normal. So sure enough, take a look underneath the car, look at the catalytic converter. I can see through the heat shield around the O2 sensor area that the cat was glowing red. So that was the definitive sign that the coils are definitely on their way out. Instead of driving the car anymore, I parked it and I decided to go with an upgraded coil solution. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll do an install. So there's several offerings for the ignition systems for these cars. Mazda supposedly has updated the coils to a more stable version, but there's not really enough data out there right now to prove that they resolved all the ignition issue woes with them. So it leaves you to a more common option, which is switching to a GM LS2 style ignition coil. And there's a couple offerings out there. I went with Bennett built. And the reason why I chose Bennett built is because after speaking with Tim, the owner of the company who developed the systems, as well as some other unique parts for the RX-8 to specifically address some of the common problem areas, I think his system was competitively priced, and it offers everything that I was looking for a direct, bolt-in, plug-and-play ignition coil solution, and that's why I ended up going with him. So I received everything. It was packaged rather nicely, adequate packaging here. And the solution is actually rather attractive, as it comes with a nice mounting bracket that's etched with the Bennett built logo, and it uses MSD 8.5mm ignition coil wires, as well as a provision to add additional grounding to the system, which is pretty neat. Having this conversion with all the conversion plugs opens up the door to run many different aftermarket coils if you so choose to. But another nice benefit of these is that the coils themselves have these heat sinks on the top of them. Part of the reason why the coils suffer is because of their location right on top of the motor, and rotary engines just typically produce a lot of heat. So these are under a lot of stress. Combine that with a much more repetitive firing versus a traditional piston motor, they are definitely stressed, and that's one of the major reasons for the accelerated wear. So the overall package looks good, and I like simple and easy, so plug and play is definitely very desirable to me. The other thing that I picked up while I was shopping for some parts, and I think this is such a clever little solution, is that the factory gas cap on the cars, when you open up the fuel door, there's nowhere to put the cap. Most cars have a little slot to put the cap, but because it's tethered to the car, you're kind of forced to let it rest up against the paint, and I hate doing that. It makes me cringe every time I have to go pump gas in it, which is quite a bit, knowing how thirsty the 13B is. So there's a solution here, which is just a little adapter bracket that mounts inside the fuel door and allows you to put your gas cap on there. So I thought that was really clever, and gonna add that to the car as well. So let's begin with this installation, shall we? So the first steps in the installation are as follows. We're gonna remove the engine cover, battery cover, disconnect negative battery terminal, and then remove the 4 12mm nuts for the strut tower bar. So we have to make a little bit of clearance here. Our ignition coils sit right below the throttle body, so we're going to take the upper portion of the intake out. There's a couple vacuum lines, there's 3 running here, there's some vacuum solenoids on the side of it here, and disconnect the mass airflow sensor, get these clips out. We basically want to take this whole piece out to give us plenty of room to work and get the new coils in that area. See, as I was taking off my old brittle vacuum line, not even that's that old, but it obviously gets a great deal of heat, I broke the little plastic fitting in there. I keep those on hand anyways at all times. You could buy little packs of them and vacuum fittings at your local hardware store. I highly recommend having those on hand for such occasions. But the next step in this process is to actually remove the coil assembly itself and disconnect it. There's 4 10mm nuts that hold the assembly to the motor, and so we're going to take those off first, disconnect the coils from there, and then disconnect the spark plug wires. So we'll do that now. So now we're ready to install our new coils. Now at this time is probably a good time to replace your spark plugs. Mine are pretty fresh, so I'm not going to bother with that. I'm going to skip that step. It is tight coming down from here. I'll see if I could connect the spark plug wires to the ends of the spark plugs. If not, typically when I change the plugs in this car, I jack it up from here, pop the wheel, and I go in straight around the subframe to get at the plugs. I think I could probably get the caps back on by hand coming through. It's just a little bit tight. So to make things simple for the installation, the way the coil bracket mounts, we're gonna pretend that we're actually looking at the side of the engine here. We're gonna just line up each ignition coil with the corresponding spark plug. So we have our left and right trailings and our left and right leadings. So basically it's gonna follow the same suit. So trailing one to trailing one, leading one to leading one, trailing two to trailing two, and leading one or leading two to leading two. And that would make a fairly simple installation. Another thing to note is that since the leading coils are always firing twice during combustion for the wasted spark, the plugs typically wear twice as fast as your trailing plugs. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're swapping out plugs. The leadings will always look a little bit more worn versus the trailings. So one more thing to make note before we go ahead and install the ignition coil set is that Bennett provides these little aluminum spacers. They're going to go on each one of the ignition coil studs, and I'm assuming that this raises the coils up and reduces the amount of heat soak that they're going to get transferred from the bracket. If not, I could be entirely wrong. It may just be for the whole packaging of it, but you do have to install those on the studs. Alright guys, so the coils are installed. A couple installation notes, caveats. The fitment is a little bit tight. It sucks.
I'm not gonna lie, to get your hands in here and to get the bracket mounted. I found though, even though it doesn't say in the instructions, I found that it was much easier to take the tabs off for the harness where it connects to the ignition coil bracket and just move it over a pinch, and that gave me enough room to kind of get in here, route the wires how I needed to route them, and then make all my connections to each coil. So what I'm going to do is, because of the clearance is so tight, I could kind of jam this back in and use the factory clip right here, but it's going to put a lot of pressure on the first two set of coils, and I don't really want to do that, so I just zip tied it off so this way the harness is not going to fall down and hit the belts. It's also fastened here with a rivet anyways, so it's really not going anywhere, but I just want to make note of that. The coils, I followed again the suggested installation path. I'm going to show this one more time. So literally matching each color as outlined in this diagram, and then the same thing goes from the trailer leadings down to the block. So you can't really see what I did underneath the block. I went underneath the car, jacked it up to make those connections just because it's a little bit easier, and it takes a couple times, just make sure that you got everything in the correct location, and then that's it. So now to finish this girl off, we're going to just reverse the order of everything that we took out, and the only other thing that we're doing that's different is the coil kit comes with a ground. We're going to add this here to our factory ground once we make our connection back to the battery terminal, and that will be it. So let's finish it. Alright guys, so our ignition coil upgrade is complete. Hopefully we'll get good life out of these coils. I don't expect there to be any issues. The car fired right up, sounded healthy. So now we're going to do what I love to do best, and I'm going to go take it for a ride and see how it is. You may have saw that the DSC light was flashing and the traction control was off. You could disregard that. I had to disconnect the negative battery terminal. So the ECU, once you plug that back in, we'll have to learn the yaw angle. So cranking the steering wheel all the way to the left and then opposite lock to the right should allow that sensor to relearn itself. But that kind of concludes this session. If you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to leave it below. I'll do my best to answer you. And stay tuned for the next segment, which we're going to tackle getting rid of that pesky oil metering solution and allow us to run a proper rotary premix for Apex Seal longevity. Till next time, done.